Welcome, everyone. I am Liesl Olson with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us at the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame's Fuller Awards celebration for Reginald Gibbons, or Reg, as everybody calls him. And I think somebody even in the chat called him Reggie. We are really grateful to the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame for sponsoring this program at the Newberry, where we wish, of course, to be in person, but we're excited to have so many people participate this evening via Zoom. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry's reading rooms and exhibition galleries are now open to readers with no appointment necessary, Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., free and open to the public. I encourage you to check out our current exhibition called Chicago Avant-Garde, 5 Women Ahead of Their Times. And one of the women whose life and work are featured in the exhibition is Gwendolyn Brooks, a writer I know who is very important to Reg. Our Rosenberg bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday, and you can shop online anytime. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online classes, and our virtual and in-person public programs. I also want to say that recently, Reg donated his papers to the library, an incredible, voluminous collection of manuscripts, letters, including his correspondence while editing Tri-Quarterly magazine. This also led to the donation of the papers of the Guild Literary Complex. These are a treasure trove of materials documenting the capacious literary life of Chicago and the many writers who came through. We're incredibly grateful to Reg for these collections, which are now preserved in our stacks alongside the papers of such writers as Sherwin Anderson, Ben Hecht, Mike Royko, and one of Reg's favorites, Catherine Mansfield. A few years ago, Reg and I looked through some of the really amazing materials in those Mansfield papers, and it was such a great memory of working with Reg, getting to know Reg, and talking through the life of that writer in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Randy Albers, who is going to then hand it over after he's through. So thank you all for being here. Randy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Liesl. I am very happy to welcome everybody tonight. I'm board president of the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. And all of us involved with the Hall of Fame, board members, founding executive director Don Evans, valued volunteers, and generous donors are honored to have the opportunity of presenting the Fuller Award for Lifetime Achievement to a longtime leader in Chicago's literary community, Reginald Gibbons. On behalf of the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame, as well as tonight's 15 partners, I want to welcome you in whatever part of the world you are watching to tonight's festivities. And while we're at it, even though we can't hear you clapping, we hope you'll give a very warm welcome in your own spaces to Reginald Gibbons himself. I'm going to listen for that. We had, of course, intended this evening to be in person, and we had intended that the pandemic would by now be banished to the Arctic Circle or some far-off destination where it would wear itself out. Alas, that was not the case, but we'll do our very best to make you feel as if you're able to reach out and shake Reg's hand tonight. I want to begin welcoming you into the Newberry Library by calling your attention to the beautiful program. It will give you the run of show, participant bios, a profile and list of Reginald's numerous works in various genres, a catalog of his previous awards, photos, essays, and lovely tributes from many of Reginald's admiring friends from Chicago and elsewhere. You should be able to see, those of you who are on this webinar should be able to see in the chat room a link to that. But you can also see a copy, if you can't find it, you can find it on our website at chicagoliteraryhof.org. The Chicago Literary Hall of Fame honors, celebrates, preserves, and promotes the development of Chicago's great literary heritage, past, present, and future. We realize this by annual inductions of outstanding writers from the past, of course, but also by honoring living writers whose lifetime contributions to the literary arts warrant the highest recognition. And Reginald Gibbons's writing, support of other writers, and involvement in so many literary organizations and endeavors certainly warrants this honor. The Fuller Award was inspired by one of Chicago's first literary lights, Henry Blake Fuller, whose two influential novels, The Cliff Dwellers and In the Procession, were groundbreaking in Chicago's post-fire years. Suffice it to say, he was something of a rebel, taking on controversial topics, unafraid of going against the grain, and coming to exemplify the Chicago spirit. Reginald is certainly a writer bearing these qualities and one that Chicago can claim, but who over his long career has shown himself also to be truly a citizen of the world. And I must say that in these divisive days, we need more such committed citizens of the world. To see this expansive vision at work, I invite you to watch this video mini documentary of Reg's life and work.
He seldom raises his voice, but that shouldn't mislead us. The transformations he effects as he turns life into art are radical. Donald Davy. Born on January 7, 1947, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Houston, the child Reg was a superb and eager student. Reg read books greedily, especially adventure fantasies and later stories of utter boy independence. As he grew older and began his own scholastic adventure, the markings of a successful career in letters were all there. A BA from Princeton and an MA and a PhD from Stanford. He published numerous poems and stories, a book of translated poems and another of his own poetry. Then, in 1981, Reg happened to talk for a few minutes with Joyce Carol Oates. She said to Reg, "Tri-Quarterly is looking for a new editor. Would you like me to nominate you?" He got the job. That same year, Reg's second collection of poems, The Ruined Motel, was published by Houghton Mifflin. From his house in Evanston, Reg worked as a writer, entering a long, startlingly productive period that has yet to slow down. He was very happy to be in Chicago, which he considered one of the truly great American cities. As director, Reg elevated Tri-Quarterly's standing by creating a culture of greater equity in the selection process and by improving the magazine's circulation. He has said that during his editorship, he read about 100,000 poems and about 20,000 short stories and essays. Reg made it a point to be impressed only by the work, not by the name. Tri-Quarterly began to publish more Black and other minority writers. He installed the publication of poetry. Reg added book reviews and wrote a number of them himself. Under his stewardship, the magazine gathered in more international work of all genres, most of it translated from other languages. He has the ability to recognize excellence in many shapes, said the poet Sterling Plump. Reginald's greatest asset is an incredibly diverse ear. There's a great deal of wisdom and generosity there. Reg started to spend time at Guild Books in the then great 2400 block of Lincoln Avenue. His circle grew to include people with whom he would join to create the Guild Literary Complex, especially the brilliant maestro of that project, Michael Warr. Reg played a strong role in the Guild's nascent attempts to create live programming throughout the city, often collaborative and incorporating music. No other organization in Chicago was reaching out, as the Guild did, to underserved audiences and on behalf of underrepresented minority writers. While Reg claims no discoveries, he published in Tri-Quarterly the early work of an avalanche of important writers and helped bring back into print the complete works of several others. Reg has worked with hundreds and hundreds of student writers who are now spread across America's literary landscape. Finally, in 1997, the same year his fifth poetry collection, Sparrow, came out, Reg left Tri-Quarterly. But even while doing so, in the service of so many, Reg's own writing career steadily won the attention and admiration of the literary world. Reg published his first and only novel, Sweet Bitter, in 1995, an enormously ambitious, sweeping story which Reg began writing at the age of 40 and spent 7 years to complete. That year, Sweet Bitter won the prestigious Anisfield-Wolf Book Award. Reg has published 11 books of poems and 2 chapbooks, several volumes of translation of poetry from several languages. His own poetry has been published in volumes of selected poems translated into Italian, French, and Spanish. His 2010 collection, Slow Trains Overhead, Chicago Poems and Stories, was an exploration of his adopted city. He regards all his writing as ways of exploring both reality and inner landscapes of feeling, memory, and perception. And his advocacy of writing beyond his own continues. After many years of helping to sustain the Guild Literary Complex, Reg became engaged in the creation of the American Writers Museum. He was invited to join the team that would conceptualize what a literary museum could or should be. This really was the enterprise of great secular people of the book, with Reg as a key collaborator on the content of the AWM. On May 16, 2017, after several years of planning, the American Writers Museum opened its doors in Chicago. Reg just celebrated his 40th wedding anniversary with Cornelia Spellman. He is the step-grandfather 4 times over. While Chicago now has a long list of local literary luminaries, Reg has managed for 4 decades to remain among the city's most important writers.
And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guide through tributes by illustrious authors, a woman who is a writer, arts administrator, and director of programs and community engagement at the Poetry Foundation. Please welcome Yudami Noriega.
Thank you very much, Randy. It is a great honor to be with all of you tonight, especially to guide you through the tribute by 4 legendary Chicago-connected writers for Reginald Gibbons. Tonight's first tribute is from Michael War. We saw a little bit of the work that Michael did in Chicago in the video to Reg. And like all of our speakers this evening, Michael has a legendary career. I have been asked to invite you to read tonight's program for everyone's full bio. And in the interest of time, I won't get to read everyone's accolades fully, but I did want to say that Michael War was the 2020 Berkeley Lifetime Achievement Award recipient and has been recognized many times for his work as a writer and his numerous books, including the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Excellence in Literature. So please welcome Michael War.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, Reginald. I don't know when I start calling Reginald Gibbons Reg. Maybe that familiarity becomes inevitable for everyone within seconds of knowing him. And much of our knowing each other is rooted in the fertile soil of poetry and the life and exchange of poems and tinkering with and surgically sculpting stanzas. And, you know, in our engagement in the poet's work, which is also the title of his 1978 anthology, from the University of Chicago Press. And of course, rooted in the pages of Teatucha Press as editors, and in our years of presenting poetry in the public square at the Guild Literary Complex. Poetry has been the lifeblood of our 30-plus-year relationship. So I'm going to use a chunk of my 5 minutes tonight to recite a poem, one of Reg's poems. Deciding which one was difficult. However, the irrepressible marketer in me dictates that the poem must be from his most recent book, Renditions, from 4-Way Books. It's a collection that's packed with masterpieces. But his poem entitled, But a Guy Goes By, at least for me, captures part of Reg, a writer who walks simultaneously in different worlds, who at one moment is translating Sophocles and at another finding life in the poems of unknown poets, which he actually did for me after working over one of my early manuscripts, which was full of poems that I'd given up for as dead. And his poem, But a Guy Goes By, also happens to be one that he wrote for Cesar Vallejo, one of my earliest poetic influences. So I can see Reg writing this poem at a cafe in Evanston, perhaps, and hear him reading it somewhere in the world quietly out loud. So here we go with the poem, But a Guy Goes By. A guy goes by with a long loaf of bread on his human shoulder. And after that, I'm going to write about my doppelganger. In the alley, I see a girl looking for meat scraps and orange rinds. Is now when I'm supposed to write about the infinite? Another guy sitting on the curb scratches himself, nabs a louse in his armpit, smashes it. And we're going to chat about psychoanalysis. A homeless woman sidewalk sleeping, her foot's behind her back. And I'm going to meet a friend so we can talk about Picasso. Some other guy swinging a stick at my bones has invaded my body. So then later at the doctor's, I'm going to talk about investments. This crippled dude goes wobbling by with a big kid arm in arm. And after that, what? I'm going to read the art reviews. Someone is shuddering in the dark, coughing, spitting blood. When exactly would it be appropriate to theorize the inner self? A roofer falls, he dies, and from now on, he goes without lunch. So now, I'm going to invent some flashy new poetic effects. This diamonds bought and sold guy, he uses rigged scale weights. So make sure everybody at the opera sees that you're weeping. Too near my building, this skinny guy deals heroin laced with fentanyl. Is this really the time to take alien sperm and astral travel seriously? The old couple at a funeral crying as they walk holding hands. And what's the protocol when you're voted into the academy? Sitting at the kitchen table, somebody's lovingly cleaning his handgun. What exactly is the good of talking about where we go after we die? A girl is run over by a local Nazi aiming his station wagon at her. And we have to hear about very nice people on both sides and not scream. A neighborhood granny goes by counting something on her fingers. And the biggies are saying, we must make sure the banks are okay. But a Guy Goes By Reginald Gibbons after Cesar Vallejo. So thanks again, Reg, for all that you have done and continue to do.
Thank you so much for that tribute, Michael Orr. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's next speaker. That is legendary Chicago writer Stuart Dykvek, whose many books include The Coast of Chicago. Stuart Dykvek has received many awards, including a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and of course, also the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame's Folger Award. Please welcome Stuart Deibeck.
Hi. Great honor to be here on Reg's award. We're old friends. Probably go back about 38 years or so. And you would think in that time, sometimes this is an opportunity not just to honor somebody, but to tell all kinds of crazy, wild stories about them. I only wish I had some. It's not like we haven't had fun and hung out. But so rather than roast him, I'm going to toast him. When he came here, as the film made clear, it was to take over the editorial position at Tri-Quarterly. that was a time of brilliant literary magazines. Some of them even had founders who were kind of famous beyond the literary realm, like George Plimpton at Paris Review. And I think Reg edited it for maybe about 16 years, which is one long time, not just to read all those manuscripts, but to have made it a part of Chicago. One of the reasons that is that there were festivals and all kinds of reading things that he would set up. And in part, one of the things that goes unnoticed when you're editing a magazine like that is that you've got to raise money for it. And so besides all that reading, Reg was a great grant finder and fundraiser. And those things kind of maybe should go under the radar. But if the person doesn't do them, the magazine doesn't happen. He absolutely changed that magazine, became more diverse. It became more international. It addressed, there was a deep sense of empathy in the magazine itself coming from its editor for problems in the world, South Africa, stuff behind what was still in kind of an iron curtain. And after that, well, actually editing that magazine seems to me a paradigm for everything else that Reg has done so far as his other roles: teacher, program builder, department chair, somebody who makes things like Guild and the Writers Museum happen. In all those roles, some of the exact same values that you see in that editing that tri-quarterly and making it a force are operative. I was talking, he'll talk with Alex Kotlowitz later tonight, and Alex and I got together the other day, and we were talking about a famous sports figure I won't name. Alex admitted that he was a tremendous talent, but he had a reservation that one of the things he didn't do was make the game better or easier for his teammates. And if I think of Reg in that context, that ability to make the world better, both for the immediate people that he touches as a teacher, as a program builder, but also through his literary endeavors, couldn't be more true. And again, at the basis of all that is a deep empathy, which going back to Randy's comment about the time we're living in, if ever there was a time that we needed empathy, it's now. One of the things that Reg and I talk about all the time when we meet, and we kind of get into this ecstatic state, is music. But after maybe 2 hours of talking about one composer or another, when Reg goes home, he's a very private person about this, I might add. Unlike me, he goes out, if he doesn't already own the score, he goes out and he buys the score. And then he sits at his Steinway and he plays all the stuff we talked about. He's the kind of guy that if he walks into a room and there's art supplies, the way he reacts to the art supplies is he's going to start painting. He's an intellectual, but he's a doing intellectual. Everything else that we've talked about, the program building, the teaching, even being a department chair, I think behind it all is a great, brilliant curatorial mind. Those are all engines for him. They're vehicles for him to express the same values and the same impulse to change the world that I began talking about when he got a hold of Tri-Quarterly magazine and did just that. The literary world that he lives in, the vehicle he's getting this award for, besides empathy being at its heart, is exactly as Michael said. The core is poetry. Poetry is the gravity in his world. It's what he orbits. He's worked in all the different kinds of forms, like the essay. The novel's brilliant, but it's the poem that's at the center of his world. I didn't know Michael was going to read a poem. I've chosen one from the same extraordinary book. You've got to, if you haven't gotten renditions, you have to. Fortunately, I picked a different poem. In this one, what he's doing is he's channeling a little bit of Boris Pasternak. One of the things I'll say about the poem before reading it is, if you've read or even just seen the movie of Dr. Zhivago, at the end of Dr. Zhivago, what Pasternak does is he's created this imaginary character, Yuri Zhivago, and he gives us a selection of Zhivago's poems. They're, of course, written by Pasternak, and they're some of the best work that Pasternak has done. And for me, this poem, Triage, could easily have appeared in that context, and you would never have known that it was not a poem that fit in with all the others. Triage. Along my hospital hall, I hear tongues speaking and people. A kind and suffering, jumbled and scared, multilingual choral improvisation. From my bed, I hear the patients and healers conversing in disheveled rooms, up crowded corridors, more beds, following diagonals of waiting, resignation, not knowing, perhaps recovery. In the whole inmost ward of myself, the beds are occupied by slow-moving remembrances, like time-lapse flower novels. At night, now, outside the closed windows within me, and outside the clinic, I see tiny stars glittering at the bare twig tips of dark, cold, sleeping winter lindens, maples. Each twinkling branch ends in a midnight candelabrum of the cosmos. He wrote it, I'm sure, before there was a pandemic, but the empathy in the poem typifies this man's career. Thanks so much, Reg.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Our next speaker is Angela Jackson, who is an award-winning poet, novelist, and playwright. Her many books and awards are legendary, and her forthcoming book will be published next year by Northwestern University Press. Please welcome Illinois Poet Laureate, Angela Jackson.
At last, Reg, you get something of what you deserve. A friend of mine, who is a poet and scholar, told me once that the best critics were generous. It was not Reginald Gibbons who said this, but it is Reg who personifies it as critic and poet and novelist and editor and friend. That generosity, undergirded by a breathtaking brilliance, makes for a manner of genius that is quiet and understated, never calling attention to himself, passing it to others, which is not to say that he is a wimp or absent-minded professor, for he is formidable, a slayer of human dragons, especially the would-be tyrants. He speaks with ancient moral authority. But let me go back to his generosity that is charged with the visionary. He has created or helped create Brooks Day, Guild Complex, anthologies of Chicago writing and South African writing. He brings to our attention works he deems worthy of continued regard. Some works he helps make ready as an editor, I know, and his works are worthy of being remembered. Reg's acts of kindness and decency prove his essential humanity. His care for less able poets and writers are testaments to his goodness. I would not embarrass him or his life partner, memoirist Cornelius Spellman, by telling stories of extraordinary kindness and regard for fellow writers. Reg, as a novelist, leaves us with the incredibly lush and resonant sweet bitter. As a poet, his voice will linger and linger. One of my favorite lines of poetry from Lucky's, A Conversation with the Poet's Father. The years are smoke. Oh, yes, it is true. The years are smoke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela Jackson, who I should note is also a Fuller Award recipient from the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. Tonight's last writer's tribute is from Chris Abbani, an acclaimed novelist and poet who now lives in Chicago. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a Board of Trustees professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at Northwestern University. Please welcome Chris Abbani.
Thank you, Dami, and good evening, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. What Remains by Reginald Gibbons. Yes, bread that's poisoned and not even one sip of air. How hard it is for the wound of life to be cured. Joseph himself, sold to Egypt as a slave, could not have been more heavily grieved. Then under the sky swarm of stars, Bedouins came. They quiet their horses, then in turn, with eyes closed, each invents some chanted fragment of their day of epic nothing that brought them only boredom. For among such riders, littles needed to inspire. In the dunes, one man lost a quiver of arrows, others traded some geldings for a mare. Events are only a mist that thins and disappears. But if such songs are sung out to the end with all the heart, with all the breath in the lungs, almost everything vanishes. And what remains is the desert vastness, the stars, and one who sings. I'm Nigerian, and if I don't read what I wrote, we'll be here all night, so forgive me if I look away from you. In prose like sweet bitter, poetry like creatures of a day, last lake and renditions, translations of Russian and Greek poetry, scholarly and intellectual explorations like how poems think, Reginald continues to push deep into thought and emotion through to a complicated and elegant humanness. Not as a way to avoid the complications of race and violence, gender and its restrictions, class and questions of immigration, native nations and family. On the contrary, Reginald engages all of these driven, I believe, by a stubborn love or hope, which is, I suppose, a kind of love in a way of speaking. That stubborn insistence is to resist forgetting, to reverse as much as possible the cognitive dissonance that comfort can and often does use to defocus our gaze. When I first met Reginald in 2009, I was not expecting him. A kindly, urbane, soft-spoken man who wears the disguise of a middle-classdom with an easy grace. But what became obvious in just a few moments of conversation was how complicated and ungentle his experience of growing up actually was, how hungry he is to see with as open a mind and heart as possible, how wide his human and literary vocabulary is, African writers, Japanese writers, ancient Greek writers, Russians, Americans, and many, many other kinds of literatures, places, and people woven together with respect, with admiration, and a non-invasive curiosity, and a constant dialectic juggle. A complex, interesting, and very generous, and a very kind man. I had come to Northwestern as a guest of the Center for the Writing Arts, which Reginald had established and directed. In the time from then until the center was merged into our current MFA program just over 4 years ago, Reginald curated one of the most diverse and eclectic visitors lists I have ever seen. He brought more African writers to Northwestern than the Program for African Studies ever did. He brought writers from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe. He brought poets, novelists, playwrights, experimental writers, so many more. His own writing and literary output is staggering and prolific, but for me, it is this openness of art and intellect, this championing of writers, this literary citizenship, driven not by a political ideology and not even a nod towards inclusiveness, but by his insistence that we can only know ourselves in relationships of admiration, respect, inclusiveness, and deep fellowship. I travel the world for festivals and readings, and in obscure parts of this planet, I'm approached by people who ask me, hey, you know Reginald Gibbons, you teach with him? They tell stories of airport runs, of dinners, of paychecks, of shared readings, and always about challenging, fascinating, funny, and stimulating conversations about literature, about place, about people. What a thing, the sheer amount of goodwill, like small gold coins, he has left in so many pockets. Coins spent with other strangers who bond over his generosity and human heart. That literature and our shared humanity are not just subjects for his work, but a part of a lived literary citizenship is a rare and remarkable thing. That is a lifetime achievement I would most love to celebrate, and I'm glad I'm able to. Reginald, as we say in Igbo Dinkpa, you are a human heavy with the presence of life. Dalo so, congratulations, my friend, my brother.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Dalmi, and everybody else. I am not going to try to add on to the thoughts about Reg. I think that the eloquence of all the speakers tonight was wonderful. What I do want to say is that as the founding executive director of the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame, we started this program to award one in Chicago in a year, and then it became two for their lifetime achievements. And when we set out, we wanted it to be a real community celebration. And it took a few years to get the momentum to do that. But this ceremony tonight, to Reg, you've seen woven into and out of all of the stories that you're hearing tonight, the stories in the program, the great partners who have joined us tonight, the people who have contributed to the program, the people in the audience. It's really a coming together of the whole Chicago literary community and much beyond. And of course, a well-deserved honor for Reginald Gibbons. I want to present to him the 2021 Fuller Award for Lifetime Achievement to Reginald Gibbons. Congratulations, Reg.
Gosh. I thank Don and his selection committee for the heart-filling honor of this award, and I'm very grateful for it. And to those who have spoken tonight of me and my work, I offer my humbled and heartfelt thanks, as I do to those who sent written tributes. And I thank Cornelia Spellman. It's from our life together with her children, and in more recent years with their children, that I have learned so much that I had not yet learned before she and I met about life and love, and learned from her picture and storybooks for children and parents about the beauties and the vulnerabilities of childhood. My inner landscapes have been sort of gone by in passing here. Began, before Chicago, began in Texas, and I've lived in the Northeast US and the Bay Area and traveled to some other countries. There are writers who are somehow mostly self-forming creatures, but I'm not one of those. I have needed all those kinds of encounters. The mature stage of my becoming myself as a writer began when I moved to Chicago in 1981. Not only because after a sequence of adjunct teaching positions, I was taking on larger responsibilities as the editor of Tri-Quarterly. It was also because I began to live and to work and to see in what people call Chicago land, in my case, mostly Evanston and Chicago. I've lived here within the immense complexity, the existential, political, cultural, racial, ethnic, and ecological complexity of this metropolis on the shores of an immense body of water, the human city, and the forces of nature as closest neighbors. And immersing myself in all the variety of Chicago's cultures and the wondrousness of the lake has been so important to me as a person and a writer. My many Chicago years have been the completion, the addition to, I hope I'm not finished, the completion of my education as an individual within history and within change and within nature, living and working and thinking and writing. The mature stage of my continuing to become a person also began with a new life, coming here with my wife Cornelia and her two children, who were at that time 2.5 and 11. So I learned a lot from public school days and their friends, their athletic pursuits, their joys, their accomplishments, and the inevitable sorrows and milestones of childhood and youth. This is all part of me finally becoming who I seem to have been able to become anyway. I'm thinking about all these years that have gone by in terms of some snapshots in my mind, not pictures that were ever actually made. I'd only been in Chicago for a short while when a friend elsewhere told me I should go to a small gallery, it doesn't exist anymore, the next week, because the North Dakota poet Thomas McGrath was down from Minneapolis to give a reading. So I met him in Chicago, and that friendship lasted until he died. Soon after starting work at Tri-Quarterly in Northwestern, I met Lee Webster and also heard from the poet Michael Harper that the hardback edition of the collected poems of Sterling A. Brown, which Michael Harper had persuaded a publisher to bring back into print, was now going out of print. Lee and I put another Chicago press and Tri-Quarterly together so we could try to publish a paperback edition. We could not let this iconic American poet disappear again. And we did publish it. Here's the snapshot. Lee's office for another Chicago press and storing the books was in a huge warehouse way down Western Avenue. He'd rented a cheap but windowless space there. He and I and his board members would meet there to work on projects. The almost uninhabited building was massive, dusty, and to get to the Another Chicago press space, you had to take a gargantuan freight elevator, the kind where the massive heavy doors don't slide open left and right, but instead above and below, like some kind of incredibly huge trap for a mammoth maybe, or like meeting in that room in the cave of the Cyclops. This was what small press publishing was like around 1990. And there was Guild Books, the store with the wildest assortment of literary and other magazines I'd ever seen, fantastic multicultural shelves of poetry and politics. And in the same block of Lincoln Avenue, I gave my first poetry reading in Chicago at the Red Lion with Michael War and with Patricia Smith. There was that one and only time the AWP met in Chicago in 1986 at what was called then the Intercontinental Hotel on Michigan Avenue, where I met Alice Munro, one of my goddesses of fiction, and I manned the triquarterly table in the book exhibition. I was so pleased it had come to Chicago, and I think it was because Liesl Mueller and I had suggested and urged AWP to do that. This snapshot's of me, rupturing a disc in my back, lifting hefty boxes of triquarterly out of the trunk of my car and heaving them onto a dolly because the bellhop who came out with the dolly to help me seemed to be about 82 years old, and I didn't want him to hurt himself. Okay, that's small press publishing too. It's very physical. There were unforgettable little guild fundraising dinners with Anchi Min and with Adrian Rich. There were all those different venues for guild complex events, and the best two, the old hot house and then the basement of the, I should say, the lower level of the Chopin Theater, and sometimes the upstairs. It was upstairs for a full house of mostly teens that Luis Rodriguez gave a reading and talk from his autobiographical book, Always Running. And a small teen boy with an edge in his voice, having heard Luis speak about having been in prison, called out somewhat aggressively, "Were you ever afraid?" And after a brief pause, Luis called back to him, "Every day." Luis is a great man for reality, having come up the hard way and transformed himself and made it possible for others to do so. From him, I learned a lot. Also at the Chopin Theater, there was an unforgettable reading by Gwendolyn Brooks. She came and participated in many events. She sat on an old-fashioned upholstered chair on a low dais of wood with a lamp at her side, as if she was in her own apartment, her own house, but reading aloud to a full house of guests, of listeners, bringing, as she certainly could, the full power of her work. Other events, like John Edgar Wideman reading from his most recent novel, accompanied by blues harmonica player Sugar Blue. One day I was downtown on Wabash, and I was meeting the manager of the old Crocs and Brentano's bookstore. I was waiting on the sidewalk. He came out the door. We were going to have lunch together. There was a line of people coming out that door and going all the way to the end of the block. "Who's signing books in there?" I asked him. "Oliver North," he said. I thought to myself, welcome to America yet again. But in rich, pleasing, and disturbing ways both, Chicago has been welcoming me again and again to the real America. There were many tremendous events sponsored by the Guild, but for me, the most memorable was when a literacy center teacher brought 7 or 8 recent adult immigrants to the US who were learning English from him. Each of them read to the audience their first composition in English, 1 paragraph. The topic, how I came to America. And then on top of that, which was tremendously moving, the feature reader was Angela Jackson. On the day of Gwendolyn Brooks's funeral in Hyde Park, there was a roaring Chicago blizzard that had begun hours before dawn. And Cornelia and I and our short story writing friend Eileen Cherry, who somehow had managed to get to our house in Evanston, shared a deep disappointment because despite my shoveling snow frantically as it was still falling, I could barely get our car out onto our narrow side street, and then I couldn't even drive it to the end of the block. And yet, the blizzard almost seemed to be the earthly marker of what a huge loss had befallen all of us. It was somber. It was funereal snow. It was almost ceremonial snow. There was a great reading by Adrian Rich and Patricia Smith in a full Preston Bradley Hall at the Cultural Center. There was Ralph Ellison signing books after a reading and talk at Harold Washington Library. There was Printers Row year after year. There were the wonderful Brooks Day celebrations that began in 2013. To plan Brooks Day, Guild board members and writers, performers, and others from the South Side would meet a number of times at the invitation of Hakeem Magabuti in a beautiful room at his Third World Press, or we met in coffee shops. There were my long walks in Jackson Park with Norman MacLean, talking about novels and life. And then I would pretend I also was a Hyde Parker for the afternoon, and we'd go to Jimmy's Woodlawn Tap for burgers and beer. Another great Guild event and venue, the tremendously powerful reading by Carolyn Rogers and Angela Jackson at the Southside Community Arts Center. The last such center in America still standing in the building where it was founded. There was the reading where Studs Terkel introduced Grace Paley and Michael Warr at what was then called the Chicago Historical Society. There was such a richness that was so inspiring and, as I said earlier, educating for me. There was a night I walked into Blue Chicago to meet Sterling Plump there, and immediately my body was vibrating to the enormous volume of Willie Kent's band, for which Sterling had written some blues lyrics that they were, and numbers they were doing that night. I saw Sterling up at the front table writing in a notebook. I went up and sat beside him and yelled into his ear, "I just understood something about you. This place is your Paris cafe." He grinned a big yes at me. There was the big party for the Chicago issue of Triquarterly in 1984. I carried a copy of the issue around with me and got as many of the writers as I could to sign it. Gwendolyn Brooks signed it, Harry Mark Petrakis, Liesl Mueller, Gene Wildman, the great photographer and sculptor Stephen Deutsch, who taught me a lot, Norman MacLean, David Hernandez, Saul Bellow, Paul Carroll, Cyrus Coulter, Art Shea, Leon Forrest, many others. All these are part of my education. My Chicago era, the longest of my life actually in one place, has been my education as a writer. There were some negative moments. They're kind of amusing to me. I hope they don't sound non-amusing to you. Dinner at a posh apartment on Lakeshore Drive, to which Cornelia and I had been invited. This was in the early 80s, and Saul Bellow was there. And when all the guests were called to the very large dining table, I had to edge myself in between him and Cornelia. I saw where he was going. There was Mark Strand smiling at me mercilessly, icily, before I was to introduce him at his reading at the Art Institute. Stewart mentioned my fundraising. There were many scenes of me figuratively getting on my knees to ask for some money, but I learned a lot from this. If you've ever happened to be at least in the foyer of the Chicago Club, you will have noticed that 3 brass steps up, just a little to the next level, and are polished to look like solid gold and represent those steps. Those would-be gold steps represent all the places where money's not so often for us small organization arts funding petitioners. I did get one room further in that time. I was meeting a potential donor there, made my pitch in a room big enough to be a house, and only I and the donor were there in armchairs in one corner. But the person I met first lectured me on how to raise money, naming every way in which I'd already tried and done, just enough to keep tricorderly going. So after explaining to me what I already knew, he said no. And then he said he had to go upstairs for lunch with Henry Kissinger. Okay, Chicago is a major metropolis. And, you know, sometimes people who are not so great come through. My album has hundreds and hundreds of live snapshots in it. For me, the excitement and the learning process of participating in the creation of the American Writers Museum here in Chicago was amazingly rich. There were these big meetings of writers and scholars, museum directors and museum builders, book reviewers, editors, publishers, visionaries, fundraisers, cultural presenters, sat around big tables and talked. On a more intimate scale, I should mention an informal, sometimes hilarious, sometimes righteously outraged seminar of friends that used to meet for lunch from time to time at Furama, a dim sum restaurant at Broadway and Argyle. Sasha Heyman, Stuart Dykvek, Alex Kotlowitz, and I know I'm aware this was kind of a boys' club, but our perspectives on writing, politics, food, and Chicago itself, and the multiple worlds we brought with us to the lunch table, for me, that was so Chicago. And last, I'll mention another mentor for me regarding African-American writers and writing, my colleague at Northwestern, Leon Forrest. Not only in his books, which are dazzling, but in many conversations too. He was also a walking encyclopedia of the South Side, of Hollywood movies, and the artistry of fiction. When we talk about books and writers and what should have happened or might have happened instead of what did happen here and there in Black Chicago or in the life of writer X or Y, he'd give me the ultimate reminder to be humble and to learn. Reg, you got to go there to know there. My life and my work wouldn't be what it is without all this and so much more. Living, writing, publishing, attending, organizing literary events with friends, and teaching. I have been very lucky. And in Chicago, going there as much as I could, I feel I have gotten much further in knowing there. Thank you all.
You know, it feels odd not having any applause, and I don't know if it's better having one person clapping, but that was fantastic, Reg. And we're at the top of the hour now, and we carved out the last of the evening for a conversation between Reg and Alex Kotlowitz. And nearly everybody here, I think, knows who Alex Kotlowitz is. I think he shares with Reg a rare, extraordinary ability to see and to listen and to process and to observe. And Alex's books, An American Summer and There Are No Children Here, among others, I think those two are two of the best nonfiction books written in the last 100 years. You probably know his, his great work on NPR and and as a filmmaker as well. So now I'm going to bring out Alex. I'm not going to bring out anybody. He's going to come out and he is going to talk to Reg. And then after a short conversation between those two at the end of the evening, Randy Albers will close. I want to take this last opportunity to thank everybody who is in the audience. I know from the last couple of weeks, people have been very excited, enthusiastic to be a part of this in many different ways. And having a nice big crowd here tonight is important because in the sense of a community, when people come out and they support each other like they're doing tonight, this embodies for me what makes Chicago such a great literary culture. So thank you to everybody who participated and was here tonight. And now Alex Kotlowitz and Reginald Gibbons in conversation.
Thanks, Don. Hey, Reg.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I wish it was in person. I miss our Farama days.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I loved your talk. It was so, everybody talked about your generosity, and it was so rich. I mean, here we are to celebrate your writing, and you spend 15 minutes celebrating all these writers other than yourself. Chris talked about the coins of goodwill you've left in people's pockets, and you've left plenty of those coins of goodwill in my pockets. I had, of course, the pleasure to work under you at the Center for the Writing Arts for a number of years. So anyway, it's a pleasure, man. So we only have 15 minutes, well, let's get through what we can. The first question I had for you, you spent all this time, running these organizations. You co-founded the Guild Literary Complex. You founded this MFA program at Northwestern. Your years editing Tri-Quarterly. You've helped shape the Continuing Studies program at Northwestern. You've taught, all of which I'm sure has taken you away from your own writing. And so I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that work with these organizations has been so important to you.
Well, somewhat to repeat myself, all of that was part of my education as a writer. I mean, of course, I've read, I don't know how many books I've read, but a lot of books, and I've drawn a lot from a lot of writers. I try to teach students how to use the books that they admire the most as resources for their own growth as writers, and I've certainly done that. But nothing was as shaping, I guess, as actually being with other people and, sharing ideas, trying to find your way forward to how something, what could be done, what might be staged, what might be produced. How in the world would a museum be made if you'd made it and called it the American Writers Museum? I don't know. I got so much from all that. I would never, if I hadn't gone to all those things and been involved in those things, there's a lot I would never have learned. To just give one example, and you can imagine with Guild that we had so many events. We did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events, and I went to a lot of them, most of them, but also we planned them. And with the museum, there were 5 of us on a committee. A whole bunch of scholars came up with a list of 300 American writers who needed to be included in the museum. And there was only space in the exhibit that was going to be about the history of American writing for 100. So those conversations with my other 4 committee members to try to nail it down at 100 and having to get rid of 200. Wow, you learn a lot from those kinds of things. I think I got as much as I gave from everything that I did.
And so much of that work too was, I think, celebrating emerging writers. I mean, that seems to me so kind of essential to what you've done over these years.
Yeah, I would say that my generation, when young, of poets and fiction writers, didn't get a lot of help from older writers, but that's quite different now. I think the way the generations assist each other and sustain each other is really important.
Well, and you've been also really, I mean, for you, it seems to me really important too to create a kind of community of writers, that we can sort of feed off of each other's work. I want to talk a little bit about your novel, Sweet Bitter, which I just love. I mean, it's this beautiful, tender-hearted book, and deeply felt about, this young man, Reuben Sweetbitter, who's half Choctaw, who falls in love with the daughter of a local lawyer in Texas, in East Texas. And we were talking the other day, and it's about to be republished, and you had mentioned you were going back through the manuscript and actually changing things in the novel. And I kind of love this notion that this novel, which has been around for many years now, that there could be a fluidness to it. Can you talk a little bit about this experience of coming back to this work?
It's interesting. In the last couple of weeks, 2 different people told me the same anecdote about Toni Morrison, which I hadn't heard, being interviewed on 60 Minutes or something. She said about Beloved, and Toni Morris is another one of my goddesses of fiction. She said about Beloved, if only my publisher had given me 3 more weeks. And I knew exactly what she meant, because I've read through all of Sweet Bitter again. And this time through, I see things that aren't as clear as they should have been, or sentences that I just think are ugly. And how can I not, if I have the chance, how can I not spend my 3 weeks? It's going to take me longer than that to just, fix a few little things. Why not make it better?
And has it been exhilarating to do that?
It's been really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I many things in the book. I wrote the book a long time ago. I'd forgotten many of the details, and I had done a ton of research for it about the historical era, about flora and fauna, about lumber mills, about lawyers, about lynchings, about all kinds of stuff, about the history of Native peoples in Texas. And so I don't have all that in my head anymore. And actually, I'm learning from the book this time what it was that I tried to teach myself the last time when I finished it.
It's such a beautiful book. And I actually went back and listened to the interview you did with Studs when it came out. And I would it's easy to find online. I would recommend it for everyone.
When I got to FMT that day, the studio wasn't working. And he had a little pocket micro cassette tape recorder. And we sat on a couch in a room in WFMT, in the old WFMT. And he recorded the whole thing there. I mean, the audio came out pretty well. But what I noticed that just startled me was his copy of the book, it was a hardback, his copy of the book looked like it had been clawed, through sleepless nights. And everything that he wrote on it that he wanted to remind himself of during the interview later, he had written with a blue like marker, And I thought, no one in the world has ever before or will ever again use one of my books the way this man has done it. And that was typical of him. He was just so amazingly invested in the people that he wanted to talk to.
Yeah, he was such a close reader. In fact, early in the interview, he talks about this motif he kind of uncovered in the book of people walking. And you remember, I don't know if you remember this, but you said to him, I haven't even thought about that. That's how close a reader he was. He saw things that we didn't see it ourselves as writers.
Yeah.
So, Rich, to talk a little bit about your poetry, which is, one question I had, you've translated poems from Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, ancient Greek, and I'm wondering how translating other poets have influenced your own writing.
It was partly a fluke in the way it got started. I happened to be in public school in Texas when I was a kid, and in Texas in those days, those were days when elementary and junior and high schools had been infused with money because of Sputnik. But of course, it wasn't equitable. I just happened to be in a part of Texas outside Houston at that point where the white schools were getting money. And I had good teachers, and I was taught Spanish from the 6th grade to the 12th. When I got to college, I was going to be an English major, and I went to the English department where you had to be interviewed in order to be approved to be a major. And I didn't like the interviewer at all. I mean, he was really awful. And I left. He said, okay, I'll let you in then. And I said, I need to think about it tonight. He said, what the hell? I said, I'll let you know tomorrow. He was so angry. I walked across the courtyard into the Spanish and Portuguese department and said, let me in. And really that began it. I mean, I learned Portuguese to go with the Spanish, and I read a ton of poetry in Spanish and Portuguese. And to this day, I still read a ton of work in other languages, and the ones I can handle or the ones I can decipher with some help in dictionaries, because I see poetry in other languages and in other eras doing things that I would like to be able to do in English. So, there are a lot of novelist tricks in Tristram Shandy, for example. I mean, you could go there and you could collect a basket full of of things. And you could use them and people wouldn't know you'd stolen them, so to speak. You simply had built on the tradition. So I kind of spread out into some other languages doing that in my poetry.
So it sounds like it's been really helpful in some ways.
Yeah, I love translating. And also my latest book, they're not translations. A few of them are pretty close, but mostly they're what I called renditions, like in music, my rendition of. So I transfer the locale of the poem or various elements in the poem to my experience, and I draw on my experience and substitute some of that for what's in the poem. Or maybe I take 3 or 4 lines just from one poem, and because I see that from those 3 something will happen.
Yeah, it's a beautiful collection. I mean, kind of like these riffs on other.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always exploring. Every time I read a poem, I'm looking for something that strikes me especially. And then I turn it over and look at it from different sides and think about it. And sometimes that's something that I find a way to use myself. It was T.S. Eliot who said, "Poets don't borrow, they steal."
So true.
I plead guilty.
So, Rich, I want to read you. You wrote a recent piece. I think it was in the LA Times about the Romanian writer Norman Manea. Did I pronounce his name right?
They say it Mania in Romania. Yeah.
But you wrote, when the rushing and careening of life annul thought and numb feelings, writing can nevertheless slow the speed of darkness. And made me think about this moment in time. And I guess I wonder if you could speak a little bit, because I know for you that you've got such a commitment to equity and social justice, sort of where writers fit into this moment, especially poets.
Well, I could maybe make a list of 17 different kinds of writing politically. There's so much variety to the way people do it. It's an incredible profusion now of modes of poetry. So I don't know if I have a simple answer, but what I've done mostly is simply to have kept in mind the people who do not benefit from almost anything that we call politics. And it had to do partly with my childhood, probably, but it had a lot to do with Chicago, because when I was walking around Chicago for these 40 some years doing this or that, going here or there, I mean, you're out in a world where you see the human moment of need or celebration or desperation, or maybe I'll give this a try. And those figures, someone panhandling, someone singing the blues on a corner, a couple walking along talking, and you happen to overhear it and you think, oh my God, what a whole story there is there. All that stuff for me always takes me back to a sort of the humane side of politics, to put it that way. Of course, I was very anti-war during the Vietnam period, and all the horrible stuff Reagan did and all the horrible stuff George W. Bush did, and his father. I remember Cornelia and I went to a demonstration. It was so cold. It was on Clark and something on the north side, and it was against George H.W. Bush, going into invading from Kuwait. Those things just stay with me, but it's hard to write about them. It's hard to put them into a kind of intensity of language and feeling that isn't just rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, it feels like so much of your writing, so much of your work in some ways is about finding community. And that's how I think about so much of what you've done.
Or connection anyway.
Or connection, right. Yeah. So I don't know if we have time. I was going to ask you to read a short piece before we left. Is that, do you want to do that? Yeah.
Why don't you say why you want me to read this particular piece?
Well, I actually was, this is a piece I read a while ago and reread it recently, called River. And I think it'll be pretty evident why, well, first of all, I know this piece was meant as a kind of metaphor, but I love rivers. I find placidness on rivers, but there was something for me about this piece that made me think for the first time about rivers in a different way, and the rivers in our life in a different way. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, this is River. It's a prose piece. Stay in the river, Bill was told by Father John. Stay in the river. Don't go over to the bank and climb up there into those weeds. Stay out in the middle. Go where it's flowing. You don't know where it's flowing, but you have to stay in it. You don't have to know. You can't know. Stay in the river. But, Bill said, I've been around rivers and streams all my life. I've been up in those weeds and found those fantastic nests in there with all those eggs, those wonderful nests. That's where I like to be. But that's only till they hatch. That's only for them to leave so that they can get into the river. Even the mama leaves that nest as soon as she can with those offspring of hers, and she's got the kind that she can't leave them on the right day, and she goes back into the river. No, you can't stay there. Stay in the river. Don't be afraid of where it's going to carry you. That's where you're meant to be.
Reg, thanks so much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled for you. Yeah.
Just a wonderful conversation with really two of the leading figures in Chicago literary arts. What a privilege to sit in there. I wish it would have been that restaurant in Argyle, but could have. I want to thank some people. Thanks to filmmaker Race and Esteban for wonderful work on the video documentary, and to Kevin Theus for voiceover. And thanks to all of tonight's smart and articulate participants. During this difficult year, the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame has taken extraordinary steps to bring you a great variety of events, as well as writing classes for youth. You can find our events calendar, lists of award winners, a variety of literary resources, and an opportunity to donate on our website at chicagoliteraryhof.org. We appreciate your support. And we invite you to join us for upcoming final Fuller Award of this year to Luis Alberto Revilla on October 28th, a hybrid event hosted at the National Museum of Mexican Art. And then join us again for our online auction at December 10th. Our gratitude goes to our hosts at the Newberry Library, especially to Elizabeth Cummings and Lisa Olson, and to our other co-presenters tonight, Northwestern University, the American Writers Museum, the Poetry Foundation, the MFA Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College, the Chicago Public Library, Guild Literary Complex, Four Way Books, Associated Writers and Writing Programs, the English and Creative Writing Department at Columbia College Chicago, LSU Press, Greater Reach Consulting, the National Museum of Mexican Art, and especially the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation for a generous grant that helped us weather the pandemic and plan for the future. We hope you'll support all of these partners. We also thank all of our own individual contributors as well as volunteers. I want to give a special thanks to our extraordinary executive director, Don Evans, for his vision and boundless energy, to the very thoughtful Fuller Award Selection Committee that he co-chaired with that Chicago Treasure book list senior editor, Donna Seaman, and to the incredibly talented and committed CLHOF board members with whom I'm privileged to work, all of whose names you can find in the program. Reg, thank you for all you have given to Chicago and the world with your work and your support of others' work. On behalf of the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame, our partners, and all the people from many corners of the world who have been brought into the Newberry tonight, congratulations on your well-deserved Fuller Award for Lifetime Achievement. We applaud you and look forward to hearing your voice for many years to come. As you noted, you are not finished. And again, our special thanks to the Newberry Library for sponsoring this program with the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight to pay tribute to the remarkable Reginald Gibbons. Please, everyone, Wear your masks, get your boosters, and keep doing what needs to be done in order that all of us at the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame can safely see you in person at the next Fuller Award on October 28th and in events in the upcoming year. Keep checking chicagoliteraryhof.org. Now, please take a look at the next few slides to read about the Newberry's upcoming programs. You can register for them and other programs at newberry.org. Thanks again to the Newberry. Have a good evening, folks.